She had not been surprised in 300 years. Not when the twin suns of Kethra Prime collapsed simultaneously, an event her astronomers had called mathematically impossible. Not when the Velhari Collective, the most technologically advanced civilization she had ever conquered, detonated their own star rather than kneel. Not when her own High Council, in the 47th year of her reign, attempted to poison her with a toxin that took 11 years to develop and killed her for exactly 4 minutes before her immortal blood reversed the damage. Nothing surprised Empress Viara anymore. She sat now on a throne of living crystal, a single organism grown over for centuries, its roots threading to the entire floating palace like nervous tissue, and watched the invasion of Saren for the way a bored child watches rain. Her fingers rested motionless on the armrest. Her silver eyes, the color of a star going cold, tracked across a dozen holographic screens without truly seeing any of them. Sector 7 has been secured, Your Radiance, said General Orvith, his voice flat with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that enthusiasm was dangerous around the Empress. Resistance in the northern continent is minimal. The colonial defense force numbered fewer than 300 soldiers. They had been neutralized. Viara said nothing. She watched the city burn on screen 4. It was a small city, barely 500,000 people by the census her intelligence officers had filed 6 weeks ago. The fires looked like orange flowers blooming in the dark. She remembered when the sight of a burning city had meant something to her. She had tried, in recent decades, to reconstruct that feeling, the way a person might try to remember the details of a dream, reaching for the texture of it, certain it had been real, finding only smooth absence where the memory should have been. It had been so long. Your Radiance. This was Admiral Sen, her fleet commander, a woman who had served Viara for 40 years and had learned to read silence the way sailors read weather. There is one anomaly in the southern sector. Viara's eyes moved. Not her head, just her eyes, a degree of motion that her court had learned to treat as equivalent of jumping to attention. One man, Sen continued, pulling up a feed from an outlying colonial district. Captain Dinikoran, transport pilot, no significant combat training on record. He appears to have stayed behind when the civilian evacuation ships departed. A soldier left behind? No, Your Radiance. He was not assigned to remain. The evacuation records show he was on the manifest of the 3rd Civilian Transport. He stepped off the ship. Sen paused. He gave his seat to a family of 4. Viara looked at the feed. It showed a street in a mid-sized colonial district, the kind of functional, unglamorous settlement that existed only to extract resources from a world that did not particularly want to be extracted from. Prefabricated housing, industrial infrastructure, wide roads designed for cargo vehicles, all of it gray and practical and human. In the middle of it stood one man. He was not particularly impressive to look at. Medium height, the stocky build of someone who spent long hours in zero-gravity cargo holds. His hair was dark, his face unremarkable, currently streaked with blood from a wound above his left eye. He wore the blue-gray uniform of the Saren Colonial Transport Authority. Not a military uniform, not even close. He had, somehow, destroyed 2 of her Empire's scout vehicles. This fact arrested Viara's attention in a way nothing had in a very long time. How? She asked. Improvised explosive device constructed from cargo bay fuel cells and an irrigation timer, Sen said. She sounded like she was trying not to laugh, and had decided that trying not to laugh in front of the Empress was significantly preferable to actually laughing. He also disabled a 3rd vehicle by dropping a storage container on it from a loading crane. A storage container. 30 metric tons. He apparently calculated the trajectory manually. Sen cleared her throat. Our ground commander has filed a request for additional forces to secure the district. Viara looked at this one man in his transport pilot's uniform, bleeding quietly in an empty street, and felt something shift very slightly in the cold architecture of her attention. Tell the ground commander to wait, she said. Sen blinked. Your Radiance? Tell him to wait. Viara leaned forward, a movement so rare that 3 of her personal attendants actually flinched. I want to watch this. The first 48 hours of D&E Corrin's stand were, by any military standard, absolutely baffling. He had no weapons. He had no armor. He had no training beyond a mandatory 6-week colonial defense course he had completed 9 years ago and, by his own later admission, mostly slept through. What he had was an encyclopedic knowledge of the Sarin for Colonial District's infrastructure, a transport pilot's deep understanding of load-bearing physics, and what could only be described as profound personal stubbornness. He turned the district into a maze. He knew which storage warehouses could be sealed from the inside. He knew which maintenance tunnels ran beneath the streets. He knew which cargo cranes could be operated remotely, which fuel depots were pressurized, which industrial fans could be reversed to flood corridors with chemical vapor that was non-lethal but thoroughly disorienting. He also, apparently, knew how to be very funny under extreme pressure. Viara discovered this on the second day, when her forces finally established a communication channel to the district in an attempt to negotiate a surrender. Standard procedure. Her officers had expected either silence or pleading. Instead, Corin answered immediately. "Oh, thank goodness," he said. His voice was cheerful, with the particular brightness of a man operating on no sleep and too much adrenaline. "I've been trying to get someone on the line for hours. I have a complaint I'd like to file." Her officer blinked. "A complaint? About the invasion, specifically the scheduling. I had a cargo run to the outer belt this Thursday. Very important delivery, medical supplies for the Terra Station. And now, obviously, that's not happening, which means I'm going to miss my delivery bonus, which I was going to use to fix my ship's port thruster, which has been making a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal trapped inside a larger dying animal." A pause. Who do I talk to about compensation? There was a long silence from Viara's officer. "Surrender," he said finally, "and we will discuss terms." "Surrender terms." "Wonderful. Here are mine. You leave. All of you. You get back in your very large and very impressive ships. You fly away, and in return I promise not to drop anything else on your vehicles. That's a genuine offer, by the way. That crane thing took a lot out of me, and I'd rather not do it again." Viara, watching from her crystal throne 300,000 kilometers away, felt something stir in her chest. She pressed a hand to her sternum, briefly, as if checking whether her heart was still there. It was. It had kept beating for 400 years without her permission, and she had long since stopped being grateful for it. But she noticed it now. She watched Corin vanish back into his maze of warehouses and maintenance tunnels, watched her forces regroup and advance, and find nothing but empty corridors and creative new disaster waiting for them around every corner. And she could not look away. He was afraid. She could see it in the way he moved, the careful, controlled motion of someone managing panic with both hands. He was not brave in the effortless way of trained soldiers. He was brave in the far more difficult way of someone who was terrified, and doing it anyway. She had forgotten that kind of bravery existed. "Keep the ground forces on hold," she said quietly. "Your Radiance," Sen said carefully. "The district is a single civilian settlement. Our forces could resolve this in—" "Keep them on hold," Viara repeated. "I want to see how long he lasts." She did not examine why. On the third day, Danny Corin talked to himself. Not anxiously, not the fractured muttering of a man coming apart. He narrated. He kept up a running commentary on everything he was doing, as if filing a report to a very patient supervisor who needed every step documented for the record. "Okay," he said, wedging himself into a ventilation access crawlway with a bag of salvage components over his shoulder. "Current situation. Still not dead, which I'm counting as a personal victory. I've got maybe 4 hours before they figure out the maintenance tunnel entrance by Section C, which means I need to relocate the primary relay before then, which means I'm going to have to go past the fuel depot again, which, last time I did that, I almost definitely breathed something I shouldn't have, and I would like it on record that my lungs have never felt more artistically interesting." He paused to cough. 3 stars out of 5 for the artistically interesting lung experience. Would not recommend. Viara watched this on a small secondary screen, one she had quietly redirected to run separate from a main tactical display. Her court had noticed. They were carefully not commenting on it. 40 years of serving an immortal Empress had given Admiral Sen, at minimum, excellent survival instincts, and the survival instinct of a woman who had served an immortal Empress for 40 years said, "Do not ask the Empress why she is smiling at a screen." The Empress was smiling. It was a small thing, a fractional softening at the corner of her mouth, the kind of expression that on anyone else would not merit the word smile at all. But Viara had not been seen smiling in decades, and her personal attendants were experiencing a collective emotional state of people witnessing something between a miracle and an oncoming storm. Corin had, by day 3, destroyed or disabled 9 of her vehicles, rerouted her ground forces through 3 separate false paths using reprogrammed district navigation signals, and conducted what could only be described as psychological warfare through the simple technique of being relentlessly, inexhaustibly personable at every opportunity. When her forces cut the district's power grid, he found a backup generator. When they sealed the maintenance tunnels, he found the drainage system. When they triangulated his communication signal and sent a squad directly to his location, they found an empty room, a recording device, and a handwritten note that said, "Better luck next time. There's coffee in the kitchen. I made too much." Corin, there had been coffee. Real coffee, still warm. 3 of her soldiers had drunk it before their commander stopped them, at which point everyone had stood around the coffee for several minutes being collectively unsure about what it meant that a man they were trying to capture had made them coffee. "He's maddening," General Orvith said, on day 4, in a tone that suggested he was not entirely sure this was complaint. "He's extraordinary," Viara said. Orvith went very still. He had been around long enough to know that the Empress using a word like extraordinary was either a very good sign or a catastrophically bad one, and there was no reliable way to tell which until events resolved themselves. "Your Radiance," he said carefully. "The district will need to be secured eventually. If word spreads that a single individual held off." "Let it spread," Viara said. She was still watching the screen. Corin was crawling through a service duct with a head torch and a thermos, apparently perfectly at peace with the situation. Let every world in this empire hear that one man with a cargo crane and a sense of humor held my forces at bay for 4 days. She paused. "What does that tell them?" Orvith opened his mouth and then closed it. "It tells them he's remarkable," Viara continued, quietly, "and I find I'm not ashamed to say so. The moment everything changed came on day 5. Viara was on her feet. This was unusual. The Empress conducted the administration of her empire from the throne, from the war room, from the observatory, locations where she was contained and commanding and properly imperial. She was not, as a rule, found standing 3 inches from a tactical screen with her arms crossed and her undivided attention fixed on one man crawling through a drainage pipe. And yet, Corin had found the communication array. He had spent the better part of the day for locating it. The orbital relay booster her forces had set up to coordinate ground operations. It was mounted on the roof of the district's main administrative building. For stories up in a location that required crossing 300 meters of open ground that her forces had very deliberately left covered. He had crossed it at 3 in the morning, using a combination of cargo netting, a wheel maintenance cart, and what Viara's analysts described in their official report as an unreasonable amount of personal confidence. He had reached the array. He had modified it. What he had done, specifically, was jury-rigged the array to bounce a signal not just to the local orbital relay, but all the way up through her fleet's own communication network, the backbone signal that every ship in her invasion force was using. He had done this with tools from a maintenance kit and knowledge he had, apparently, picked up from a technical manual he found in the administrative building's archive. He then sat down on the roof of the building, with the whole open sky above him and her forces somewhere in the city below, and began to talk, not to her forces, not to negotiate, not to plead, to her. "Okay," said Denis Corin, his voice traveling now through every speaker in every ship in the Viaran Imperial Fleet, including the throne room of the Crystal Palace. "I know you're watching. I know you've been watching for days. I don't know exactly how high up this goes, but given that my forces have been stuck on standby for 5 days instead of just rolling over me, I'm guessing it goes pretty high." Viara went absolutely still. "So here's the thing," Corin continued. He sounded tired, genuinely tired now, the adrenaline wearing down to something quieter and more honest underneath. "I'm not going to win this. I know that. I've known that since day 1. You have a fleet. I have a crane and some fuel cells and an increasingly concerning cough." He paused. "But I bought about 4 days, which means the evacuation ships made it out. which means the people who were here, about 40,000 of them, they're safe. And I guess I wanted someone up there to know that they existed. The throne room was completely silent. There was a woman named Tereth on the third transport. Corin said. She ran the bakery on the main street. She made this bread. I don't even know how to describe it. It was the kind of bread that made you feel like the universe was basically okay. And there was a kid, maybe 10 years old, named Poe, who used to sneak into the cargo bay when I was doing maintenance, and I was always mad about it, but actually I never was. And there was an old man named Varric, who sat outside his door every morning and greeted everyone who walked past. And I always thought he was just lonely, but now I think maybe he was doing something deliberate, paying attention, keeping track. A pause. I just wanted somebody powerful to know that those were people, not a territory, not a resource. People. Viara realized, after a moment, that she had sat down. She was not sitting on the throne. She was sitting on the steps of the dais, which she had not done in living memory, and her hands were flat on the crystal, and her eyes were closed. I don't know if this changes anything, Corin said. I don't know if this reaches anyone who can change anything. But if you've been watching, and I think you have, then you already know what I'm doing here isn't really about tactics. He laughed quietly. I'm not a soldier. I'm a cargo pilot. I'm here because someone had to be, and I was the one who couldn't get on the ship. He paused one final time. So, that's it, I think. I hope the bread was worth something. Over and out. The fleet communication channel closed. The throne room stayed silent for a very long time. Then Empress Viara opened her eyes, and Admiral Sen, watching her, understood that something had shifted irrevocably in the weight of things. The way you understand, watching a cliff face, that a stone has begun to move. She told no one what she was going to do before she did it. This was not unusual. Viara had not been in the habit of explaining herself to anyone for approximately 3 centuries. What was unusual was the destination she entered into her personal transport's navigation system at 4 a.m, while her court slept and her fleet hung silent over the burning world below. Saren 4, Southern District. Surface. Her personal guard captain, Nerith, discovered her plan when he arrived for his shift and found the Empress in her personal transport bay, dressed not in imperial robes but in a plain gray coat, her silver hair pulled back without adornment. Your Radiance, he said. Aerith. She was running a pre-flight check, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing these checks for 4 centuries and did not need a checklist. I'm going to the surface. Aerith's expression did the complex thing it did when he was calculating between loyalty, duty, and the instinct for self-preservation. Alone. Your Radiance, the surface is... I know what the surface is, she said, and her voice was not cold, which somehow made it more final. I ordered the invasion. I am aware of the current state of the surface. She looked at him directly, which she rarely did, eye contact being one of those human habits she had largely abandoned. I need to see it. Aerith was quiet for a moment. Then, if something happens to you... Nothing can happen to me, Aerith. That is the problem. She turned back to the transport. Tell the fleet to hold position. Tell them I am conducting a diplomatic survey. Don't tell them anything else. And Captain Corin? Find out where he is, she said, and tell him the Empress is accepting his challenge. She had descended to conquered worlds before, hundreds of them, but she had done so as Empress, armored, announced, attended by a full ceremonial guard, received by whatever local leadership remained. She descended to Saren 4 alone and landed in a ruined street, and sat in her transport for a moment before stepping out. It smelled like smoke and broken stone and something else, something organic and faintly sweet, which she identified, after a moment, as a flowering plant growing up through cracked pavement, apparently indifferent to the invasion. She crouched down and looked at it. It was a weed, a colonial weed, the kind that sprout wherever humans bring soil and seeds and don't quite manage to contain them. Small purple flowers, aggressively cheerful. She did not know its name. She stayed crouched over it for longer than made sense. That's Saren's folly, said a voice behind her. That's what the colonists called it. Brought it accidentally in a soil shipment 20 years ago. You can't kill it. They tried pesticides, manual clearance, paving over it. It just comes back. A pause. I always like that about it. She stood and turned around. D&E Corin looked exactly like the man she had been watching for 5 days, and also nothing like him. The screens had not conveyed the specific quality of exhaustion he carried. Not just physical, but the bone-deep tire of a person who had been holding something very heavy, and was not yet sure it was safe to put it down. His face was thinner than she had expected. His eyes, dark and direct, and considerably more watchful than she had anticipated, looked at her without the shock or deference she usually received from humans. He looked at her like she was a person. She was not sure when that had last happened. "You came," he said. "You asked." He seemed to consider this. "I didn't think you'd actually come. I was mostly just—" He stopped talking. "I do that when I'm scared." "I know," she said. "I've been watching." "Right." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she recognized as a human reflex, for "I don't know what to do with this information. That's a bit strange, isn't it? From my end, I mean, no offense." "Some offense is warranted," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then, extraordinarily, he smiled. It was a tired smile, crooked and a little bewildered, but it was real. She recognized real expressions because she had spent so long studying the artificial ones her courtiers wore that the genuine article had become distinct. "Okay," he said, "if we're really doing this, if you actually want to see it." He looked out at the ruined street. "Come on." He showed her the bakery first. It was a small building, single-story, modest frontage, the kind of place that existed in every human settlement and was always slightly more important than it looked. The front window was broken, the door hanging open. Inside, the cases were shattered and the floors were dusty with debris, but the ovens were still intact. Corin stood in the middle of it, and the exhaustion shifted into something else, something quieter. "Teretha's grandmother built this place," he said, 70 years ago. Teretha grew up in the apartment above. She used to say the building could navigate itself, that enough generations of the same family had walked the same paths in the same dark that the house had learned the route by osmosis. He was quiet for a moment. The bread recipe was older than the shop. She said it came from a world she'd never been to, through 4 generations of people who'd never gone back. Viara stood in the ruined bakery and looked at the ovens and thought about 4 generations of women who had carried a recipe across the stars. "She is safe?" she asked. "She made the transport." A pause. "I made sure of that." They moved on. He showed her the school. He showed her the park. A tiny thing, 3 benches and a flowering tree that had been planted by the original colonial surveying team as a joke about optimism, and had grown anyway. He showed her the community hall with its wall of photographs. Every family who had lived in the district, organized by year of arrival, going back to the original settlement. He showed her Varric's chair. It was outside a small house on the main street, a wooden chair with worn armrests, positioned at a precise angle to see both directions of the road. A cup was still on the small table beside it, half full, as if Varric had stepped inside and would be back in a moment. "He was here every morning when I left for my cargo runs," Corin said. "Didn't matter what time, didn't matter what weather. He just bore witness, I suppose. Waved at everyone, knew everyone's name." He looked at the empty chair. "I don't know his last name. I never asked. I assumed there would be time." Viara looked at the empty chair for a long time. There were tears on her face. She noticed this with the distant surprise of someone who has discovered an object they were certain they had lost. There it is, having been there all along. She did not wipe them away. "I haven't," she began and then stopped. "I know," Corin said quietly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the chair. "I figured." For 6 hours they walked through the ruins, and she listened. This was the thing that would later seem most extraordinary to Corin, when he had time to think about it. Not that the Empress had come, not that she had wept over an empty chair, but that she had listened. She asked questions that were simple and direct. Who built this? How long did they live here? Where did they come from? And she listened to the answers with the absolute, concentrated attention of someone who had been waiting 300 years for information they had not realized they needed. He told her about the original settlement mission, 40 families, mostly agricultural workers from an overcrowded outer colony, who had arrived on Saren 20 years ago with prefabricated housing units and seed stocks, and an almost delusional level of optimism. He told her about the years of failed crops until they discovered that the native soil microbiome required specific bacterial inoculants before it would accept earth crops. He told her about the winter of the 7th year, when a fuel shipment failed to arrive and the entire settlement spent 4 months sharing heat between connected units and nearly starved, and came out of it knowing each other in the bone-deep way that shared suffering produces. He told her about the children born here, who called it home without qualification. They had no concept of the world their parents came from, he said. Not really. It was stories. History. Saren 4 was home because it was a place they'd learned to walk, the place they'd gotten skinned knees and first friends, and the particular shape of the sky at dusk that your brain codes as correct before you're old enough to know it's arbitrary. He paused. That's what you take when you take a place. Not just land. All of that. Viara walked beside him, and she was not the Empress. She had not consciously decided to stop being the Empress. It was more that the role required an audience, and there was no audience here, and without it she had reverted to something older, something that had walked through the streets of her home world. Centuries ago, as an ordinary woman who had not yet been made immortal, who had known what it was to have a specific patch of sky that looked correct. I remember the first world I took, she said. It was the first thing she had offered voluntarily. Cora went quiet and let it come. It was called Marin Vast, a water world. 80% ocean. The land masses were archipelagos. The people there built their cities on stilts above the tide lines, everything interconnected by bridges. She looked at her hands. They surrendered immediately. They were not a military civilization. I gave them a choice, as I gave all worlds in those first years. Integrate willingly or face force. They chose willingly. She paused. I told myself this made me different from conquerors. Did it? I don't know anymore. She was quiet. I stopped going to Marin Vast about 150 years ago. I stopped going to most places. My empire administered itself through proxies, and I watched the administrative reports, and the reports told me numbers. She looked at the ruined street around them. You cannot grieve a number. Corin said nothing. He had the wisdom to say nothing. I think, Viara continued slowly, that I stopped going places because if I went, I would have to know, and knowing would require me to feel. And feeling was, she stopped. It became easier not to. Yeah, Corin said. I think most people understand that. The scale is just different. She looked at him sideways. You're being generous. I'm being honest, he said. The mechanism is the same. You just had more power to insulate yourself from the consequences. He paused. Also immortality. Also immortality, she agreed. They had reached the edge of the district. The point where the colonial settlement gave way to untouched terrain, the native scrubland that the colonists had been slowly pushing back for 20 years. It was strange and beautiful in the gray morning light. Low shrubs with silver-green leaves, strange angular rock formations jutting from the earth, and everywhere the small purple flowers, Saren's folly, threading up through everything. Why did you really stay? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I told you. Someone had to. No, she said. That's the reason you gave. Why did you actually stay? He looked out at the scrubland for a long time. Because I didn't know what I'd be if I left. He said finally, I've moved cargo across this sector for 12 years. I don't have a permanent address. I don't have family, not close. I have routes, and I have stops, and I have the people at the stops who know me by name and wave when I land. He paused. This place was one of those stops. They were just my people, I think, in the way that somewhere along the way certain people just become yours, not because of blood or law, but because you showed up enough times and they let you in. He picked up a stone, turned in his hands. I couldn't protect them, but I could buy them time. And I thought, if I'm defined by anything, let it be that. Let it be that I was the person who stayed. Viara looked at him. She had ruled 412 worlds. She had conquered armies and broken fleets, and watched civilizations bend. She had met philosophers, warriors, artists, visionaries. She had spoken with beings older than her empire, and younger and stranger and more brilliant. She had never met anyone like this. You understand, she said carefully, that what you did should have been impossible. That there was no scenario in which one person with no military training should have delayed a full invasion force for 5 days. Oh, I know, he said. I was there. He smiled, and it crinkled his eyes. I was terrified every single second. And yet, he looked back at the town behind them. I think sometimes being terrified and doing it anyway is the only thing that's ever actually changed anything. She stood at the edge of the colonial settlement and looked at it. And the mathematics of what she had built shifted in her perception in a way she would later find very difficult to explain. She had an empire of 412 worlds. If she had done what Corin's world represented to every other world, if she had taken something like this from every single one, the numbers were not numbers. The numbers were 40,000 Sarans multiplied by 412 worlds, and every multiplication contained a Tereth and a Varric, and a 10-year-old named Pol who snuck into cargo bays and had to be pretended to be annoyed at. The numbers were not numbers. She had always known this, in the abstract, academic way that you know things without knowing them. Standing in the ruins of one settlement, with one tired pilot beside her, she knew it differently, all the way down. I need to make a communication, she said. Corin looked at her. Right now? Right now. She pulled out her personal communication device, slim, black, bearing the Imperial seal, and held it for a moment. You should know that this will be complicated. Politically, what I am about to say will not be popular with a significant portion of my court and my military command. Are you scared? He asked. The question surprised her into silence. Of them? No. She paused. Of what comes after? Yes, somewhat. She looked at him. Is it useful? The fear. It means you're paying attention, he said. That's not nothing. She looked at him for another moment, and then she opened the channel to her fleet. The throne room was full when her voice came through. Every senior officer in the fleet, every member of her high council with access to the main communication channel, every aide and administrator and courtier who happened to be present when the Empress's personal frequency lit up the board, all of them heard her voice come through from the surface of a single colonial world. This is the Empress, Viara said, and even through the communication channel, through however many thousands of kilometers of space between her and the fleet, the voice had the quality it always had. The quality of something that had been choosing its words for 400 years and had learned how to make every syllable land. I am issuing the following orders, effective immediately. Admiral Sen was on her feet. General Orvith had gone the color of old paper. The rest of the room was stone still. The invasion of Saran 4 is halted. All ground forces are to withdraw to the outer perimeter immediately. No further incursion into civilian areas. No destruction of property beyond what has already occurred. A pause. Any personnel who have detained civilians are to release them unharmed before the end of the current shift cycle. The silence of the throne room was the specific silence of a very large stone beginning to move. Furthermore, she continued, I am initiating a full review of the current conquest protocols across all theaters of operation. Effective until that review is complete, all active invasion operations are suspended. Another pause, shorter this time, precise. These orders are not subject to amendment by any member of the High Council or the military command. They come directly from me. If there is confusion about this, I will return to the palace in approximately 4 hours and clarify in person. She closed the channel. In the throne room, the silence continued. Then everyone started talking at once. On the surface, Corin had heard the entire thing. He was quiet for a moment after the channel closed. 412 worlds, he said. 412 worlds, she confirmed. That's, he stopped. Started again. That's a lot of people who might have a chance because of He stopped again. Because of a transport pilot, she said. Yes. He sat down on the rubble of a wall. He sat the way a person sits when their legs have decided that enough is enough and a decision has been made for them. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the ground and did not say anything for a while. I want to be clear, he said finally, that I didn't expect this. When I called you out, I was going to die. I was mostly trying to make sure someone remembered. He looked up. I didn't think it would work. That, Viara said, is precisely why it did. He looked at her. People who expect to change things calculate how to change things, she said. They make arguments designed to appeal. They optimize for persuasion. She looked back toward the town. You did not calculate. You were simply honest about what you had seen and what you valued, because you thought you were going to die and there was nothing left to lose by being honest. She paused. I have had 500 years of people try and persuade me. You were the first person in a very long time who simply spoke. He was quiet again. I don't know what comes next, he said. Practically, I mean, you've halted the invasion, but there will be political consequences, she said. Significant ones. I have built an empire on conquest. There are factions within my court who benefit from that model and will not accept this without resistance. She was matter-of-fact about it. The way someone is matter-of-fact about a fact they have fully absorbed. There will likely be an attempt at challenge within the High Council. There may be a military faction that tests the orders. I will need to be very clear very quickly about what I intend and what the consequences of noncompliance are. And what do you intend? She thought about this for a genuine moment. Not the performance of consideration, but actual thought, standing in the ruins of a district she had ordered invaded. I intend, she said slowly, to govern rather than conquer. I have 412 worlds. I have enough. She looked at him. I have far more than enough. I simply had not thought of it in terms of enough versus not enough. I had thought of it in terms of patterns, progress, motion. A pause. There is a certain personality type, I think, that confuses motion with purpose. Yeah, Corin said. I think I met a few of those. You were looking at me when you said that. I was looking at the sky, he said, absolutely straight-faced. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It was a genuine laugh. Short, surprised, involuntary. The kind of laugh that escapes before you decide to release it. It sounded rusty, like something that had not been used in a long time, which was precisely what it was. She put her hand over her mouth as if to contain it, and then, recognizing the gesture, let her hand drop. Corin was grinning. There it is, he said. There what is? I have been trying to make you laugh for about 5 days, he said. Not intentionally. But I noticed I kept doing it, and I thought, if there's a person in there, the laugh is where you'll find them. She looked at him. There's a person in there, she said. I know, he said. I know there is. She returned to the palace at noon. The approach was silent. Her personal transport moving through the fleet without announcement. The ships parting without ceremony. When she docked, Aerith was waiting, with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had spent the last 4 hours not speculating about what the Empress had done or why, and had largely failed. She stepped down from the transport. She was still wearing the gray coat. Her hair was still plainly pulled back. She had dust from the surface on her boots. She looked, Aerith would say later, to his most trusted colleague, in the careful, circumspect way of someone narrating history in real time. She looked like a person who had put something down that they'd been carrying for a very long time, and was still adjusting to the change in weight. The council has convened, he said. They are requesting an audience. Tell them I'll be there in 1 hour, she said. After I've changed. He paused. And Captain Corin? She considered this. Find him appropriate quarters in the diplomatic section. He is a guest of the Empire. A pause. He'll hate that. Tell him. He can keep working on his ship if it makes him feel better. It should be transported up within the hour. Aerith processed this. His ship is in significant disrepair. I'm aware. He told me at considerable length about the dying animal in the thruster. She moved toward the interior of the palace. Get him a proper engineering kit. Don't tell him it's from me, or he'll try to argue about it. She stopped at the entrance of the residential wing and looked back at Aerith, and in the particular quality of that look, sharp and present, and there in a way he had not seen in decades, he understood that something fundamental had changed. Send me the full administrative reports on all 412 worlds, she said. Not the summaries, the full reports. She paused. I have some reading to do. The High Council meeting lasted 3 hours. Viara sat at the head of the table and listened to 7 of the Empire's most senior officials explain to her, in increasingly elaborate and carefully diplomatic language, why her orders were impractical premature, and potentially destabilizing to an empire that had been built on a very particular model. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Are you finished?" They were. "I have ruled this empire for 4 centuries," she said. "I have conquered 500 worlds, of which 412 are currently active territories. I have built the largest single political entity in this region of the galaxy." She looked at each of them in turn, her silver eyes moving around the table with the slow, complete attention of something ancient and decided. "In all of that time, I have not once had to justify an order to this council. I am not beginning today." Silence. "The conquest protocols are suspended," she continued. "The review will proceed. When it is complete, I will implement whatever changes I deem appropriate, and this council will administer those changes as it administers everything else, by executing my decisions faithfully and competently." She paused. "If any member of this council finds this arrangement incompatible with their continued service, I encourage them to speak now." No one spoke. "Good." She rose from the table. "I have 412 sets of administrative reports to read. I will not be available for social correspondence this week." Corin fixed the thruster. He spent 2 days in the engineering bay that had been assigned to him, largely ignoring the fact that it was a significantly better-equipped engineering bay than he had ever worked in, and the tools were suspiciously high quality, and someone had restocked his food supplies without being asked. He spent 2 days on the thruster, and then an afternoon on the hull plating on the port side rear, and then an evening on the navigation system, which had been making a sound he hadn't mentioned to anyone, but which had been quietly worrying him for 6 months. He was lying on his back under the console when she found him. "The thruster," she said. "Fix." He slid out from under the console, looked up at her. She was in different clothes, something between military and formal, dark gray, no adornment except a slim silver ring she always wore on her right hand. She looked tired, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing necessary work. "How's the council?" "Alive," she said. "Unhappy." "Functional." She sat down on a crate. He noticed she sat on crates and low walls and the steps of daïses, rather than chairs, as if she had spent so long on a formal throne that informal seating required a moment's recalibration. "The review is underway. I've been reading the full reports. And, she was quiet for a moment, "and I have a great deal of work to do." She looked at him. "It is worse than I knew in some territories, and better than I expected in others, which is, I suppose, what happens when you spend a century reading summaries instead of evidence." He nodded. "What are you going to do?" "Change things. Slowly, and then faster when I understand what I'm changing toward." She paused. "I have centuries ahead of me. The advantage of immortality, if there is one, is that there is time to do things properly." She looked at her hands. "The disadvantage is that I have spent that time very badly. But the past is the past." "Yeah," he said. He sat up. "What happens to Saren 4? "The colonists will be invited to return. I'll send a full reconstruction assessment team ahead of them and fund the rebuild from the Imperial administration budget. The district should be largely restored within a year." She met his eyes. "Tara can have her bakery back." He was quiet. "You know," he said finally, "when I stepped off that transport, I wasn't thinking in terms of anything except the next 4 hours. I wasn't thinking about empires or conquest or policies. I was thinking about Poles sneaking into the cargo bay and the bread and the old man with the chair." "I know," she said. "I guess what I mean is, I'm glad it worked. But I also want you to know that even if it hadn't, I think I still would have stayed, because they were worth staying for, not as a strategy, just as a fact." He looked at her. "People are worth it even when nothing comes of it, even when no one's watching." Viara looked at him for a long time. "Someone was watching," she said quietly. "Yeah." He smiled. "Lucky break." "No," she said. "Not luck." She rose from the crate. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "When you return to your cargo runs," she paused, "would you be willing to carry something for me occasionally? Official correspondence, administrative reports, things that move between worlds that I would like delivered by someone I trust to look at the places they travel through and see people rather than territories." He looked at her. "You want to hire me?" he said. "I want to hire you. As a cargo pilot. As a cargo pilot who has demonstrated, somewhat aggressively, an ability to notice what matters." She paused. "The pay would be considerably better than your current rate." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it come with diplomatic immunity?" he said. "Because I've been flagged by at least 3 port authorities on various technicalities, and it would be nice to—" "Yes," she said. "It comes with diplomatic immunity." He thought about it for another moment. "Deal," he said. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. The handshake, the human custom, the ancient gesture of 2 individuals meeting as equals on agreed terms. She shook his hand. She stood at the observatory window that night, watching the stars. She had stood in this spot 10,000 times, looking out at the empire, at the scope and reach of it, the patterns of light that were worlds and ships and the long, slow traffic of civilization. She had looked at it as possession, as evidence of power, as a record of what she had built, measured in distance and force. She looked at it now and thought, people, all of that light was people. 40,000 on Saren 4, billions on other worlds. Each one a Terrace with a recipe, a pole with a habit of sneaking into places, a Varek with a chair and a practice of bearing witness. The scale was impossible to hold fully in the mind, but she had learned today, in the ruins of a single small bakery, that the scale did not matter. What mattered was that each light, each number, each territory on the map, resolve at close range into something specific and human and worth knowing. She had been the wrong distance away for 300 years. She had come back. Below her, on the engineering deck, a transport pilot she had tried to conquer was successfully reattaching a port-side thruster, narrating the process to no one in particular in a tone that suggested he had filed a comprehensive internal complaint about the quality of the fuel cell connectors, and was now magnanimously proceeding anyway. She listened to the faint sound of his voice through the palace's ambient monitoring, which she had never actually turned off and had never told anyone she used. She smiled. She turned back to the stars. 412 worlds, she thought, and 1 exhausted cargo pilot who stayed behind. That'll do to start. In the Empire's historical records, the halting of Saren 4 is classified as a diplomatic incident, a notation so understated it borders on comedy. Court historians, writing the years that follow, use phrases like recalibration of imperial policy and a period of strategic reflection initiated by the Empress. What the people say is different. On Saren 4, rebuilt within 14 months, they plant a tree in the main square. Not an imported tree, a native one, with silver-green leaves, thorny and angular, and absolutely indifferent to the concept of ornamental beauty. Underneath it they put a small bronze plate, and on the plate they put a name, and next to the name they put 3 words. He came back. Tereth reopens a bakery on the 1st anniversary of the return. She makes the bread, the recipe passed down through 4 generations, carried across the stars from a world her grandmother was born on and none of them have ever seen. The line wraps twice around the block. Varek get a new chair, the same angle, the same position, the same clear sight line in both directions up the main street. He is there the morning the first reconstruction team arrives, and every morning after, waving at everyone who passes, knowing everyone's name. Pole, who is 11 by this point and has been living on a refugee transport for 4 months, arrives back to find that someone has left a note on the family's rebuilt door. The note is in handwriting he recognizes. The cargo bay is unlocked. It says, "I've got some new equipment in there. Don't touch the port thruster. I just fixed it, but the NAV system needs calibrating, and you seem like the kind of person who might know how. Pole is there every afternoon for the next 2 years. Elsewhere, in 41 active territories, the first of the reconstruction assessments begin. In the Imperial Palace, the Empress reads full reports. She marks questions in the margins. She sends follow-up communications. She learns names. She does not do any of this quickly, for centuries of one way of seeing the world is not undone in a month, but she does it with a specific quality of attention she had lost and found again in the ruins of a small district on a resource colony. The attention that knows it is looking at people and takes care accordingly. One morning, she sends a communication to a transport pilot running a cargo route between Saren 4 and the Outer Belt. The bread, she writes, was worth everything. 3 hours later, a response arrives. I know, it says. I told you. And then, beneath it, there's a good settlement on Turas Station, about 12 hours out from her orbit. The woman who runs the supply depot makes something she calls crossroads stew. She says it's a different recipe every time because she uses whatever's at hand. She's been there 30 years, and no one's ever had a bad bowl. Thought you should know about it. DC. VRR reads this and saves it, and adds it to a growing file she has titled, Without Ceremony or Explanation, Worth Knowing. It is a very long file. She intends to make it longer.